Thank you, Dr. Murray, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you, but a special good afternoon to the righteous Reverend Dr. Marcus D. Cosby. And Dr. Cosby, this gives another iteration of Wheeler everywhere,
Everywhere,
Wheeler wherever.
wherever. Yes, sir.
Dr. Cosby, we're so thankful that you joined us this afternoon for the University of Houston downtown community, joining all of us for our Gator Grit series. This series, Doc, provides our community with an opportunity to hear from global leaders like yourself about current events that are trending, not just here in Houston, not just in the state of Texas nationally, but globally.
Sure.
And and as a global leader, I'm going to kick this off by asking you one question, because I see you as a change agent, and not just a change agent for the city of Houston, the state of Texas, or our nation, but a global change agent. So if you can, sir, please take a moment to share a little bit about yourself, and let our audience know basically how you came into ministry.
Surely. Well, thank you and good afternoon to you, Dr. Tillis. It's a joy to be with you. I do want to thank Dr. Murray for her very kind introduction and generous words of introduction. I am, as Dr. Murray has said, a proud native of Chicago, Illinois, with roots, of course, in Mississippi, where my family first came. Both of my parents born and raised in Mississippi, and were part of that great migration to the north and ended up in Chicago to continue their family. And so I'm a proud native of that wonderful city. And I am one who is entrenched in the work of the church. I have always been what many have called a church baby. And so the church was a part of my life from infancy through this current day. And so I have engrossed myself, enmeshed myself in the work of the church, the life of the church, and how the church can make impacts in the global community. And so I am delighted to do what I do. I've always been a lover of people and how to uplift people through the work of ministry that I've been called to do. And so that's how I came to ministry. I was first involved in music ministry. That's the first part of my life. And then it was obvious that my ministry shift was occurring. So I, from teenage years, began to look at the work of proclamation. And so I've been preaching since my late teens, early 20s.
Well, thank you for that, Doc. I'm reminded of your home pastor who
Yeah.
said that when you were a little boy, you would come out into the aisle and start directing the choir. So I
Yes.
guess
Yes.
that, from knee high to a duck on up.
Absolutely. He loves to embarrass me, and I'm grateful.
So, Doc, for over half a century, three Houston faith leaders,
Mm,
Reverend William Alexander Lawson, Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza, and Rabbi Samuel Karff, often affectionately referred to in Houston as the Three Amigos, they stood together as a multi-faith trio fighting for racial harmony, civil rights, and justice. This summer, we lost Rabbi Karff, but while with us, he used his faith relationships to call for unity. Why do you think these relationships, such as the Three Amigos, are important in the fight for social justice?
that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think it is very important because those men have stood as a symbol of what it means to disallow differences, to keep you separated from a common goal, a common aim. They understood that all of our religious traditions at some point are intended to uplift the downtrodden, intended to bring all people closer to this God whom we reverence. And so I think those three men standing together represented an opportunity for Houston and anyone else to see what it means to allow the best of your common interests to come together, to work together for the good of humanity. When we stay isolated in our own silos and disallow ourselves to communicate with and bridge the gap to other kinds of people, we reject the notion that God is the creator of all people. And when we reject that notion, we begin to have these divisive kinds of mentalities that do more harm than good. And so to see those three men, even to this day, as late as this summer, as a matter of fact, Pastor Lawson and Rabbi Karf went to George Floyd's funeral together. Wow. So as late as this summer, to seeing those men, and Archbishop Fiorenza would have been there were he not ill, but to see them always together with a genuine friendship, but likewise with a genuine goal to ensure that humanity is lifted, has always been an inspiration to me.
Yeah, thanks for that, Doc. I'm also going to push it just a little bit further with the second question in the same vein. So the second question has to do, again, why is it important to approach social justice movements from an ecumenical standpoint? And also, what has been the history of ecumenical faith shifts, which I'd like to call them, in the fight to eradicate social injustice?
Great. Now, if we allow our minds to roll back to some of the pictures we've seen of protests and marches from the civil rights movement, you would see Dr. Martin King front and center, no doubt. He was often accompanied by Sister Coretta Scott King. And then you would see white people and gentlemen with collars on. You'd see some with their heads covered. You would see an ecumenical partnership of people who understood that justice was for all. And when you see that picture, it reminds you, or it should remind you, of your responsibility in the raising of the level of humanity in the world. And so it's always been good to see those pictures of those men and women who stood together, of all racial backgrounds, of all faith traditions, joining in faith ships, I'll use your word, to ensure that there was a communal aspect to this issue of ensuring justice for all.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that too. So I'm going to switch gears here on you and go back to my life in Washington, D.C. when at Metropolitan Baptist Church with Reverend H. Beecher Hicks.
Absolutely.
The first place where I became knowledgeable of this concept, which has to do with the question that I'm going to ask you. And so what are your thoughts on the role of liberation theology as it relates to social justice movements? And how do faith leaders employ liberation theology? And also for our audience, could you just explain what liberation theology is?
Sure. Liberation theology is the understanding that those who are oppressed in any setting or any space need to have the opportunity to be released, to be freed, to have the access to a qualitative life that others would have. So it is the responsibility of those who practice liberation theology, and I'll be more specific as I talk about Dr. James Cone in just a moment with regard to Black liberation theology, because it is the understanding that anyone who is bound by social, political, or economic oppression, or structures that keep these people oppressed, keep any individual, any people group oppressed. It is the responsibility of those who adhere to these liberation theologies to speak truth to power, because there are structures, there are systems that are set in place. That's why we use the word systemic racism, because there are systems and structures that are set in place to keep people bound, to keep people back, keep people held back. And this does not start with modern day theologians. It starts with the ministry of Jesus and is rooted in the ministry of Jesus, as is found in the Gospel of Luke at chapter 4. Jesus says that the Spirit of the Lord is on him so that he might liberate people. He says, I've come to upset the status quo, come to bind the brokenhearted, to open the prison doors, to open the blind's eyes. He says, my responsibility is to ensure that any person, any people group that is oppressed needs to understand that I've come to give them freedom, or the word liberation is what we use. So Dr. James Cone in the 60s made it very clear with his seminal work that it is necessary to ensure that Black people especially, and I'll speak specifically about them, although liberation theology is much broader than Black people, but Dr. James Cone pushed it to ensure that Black liberation theology was brought to the fore, because so many Black people did not have access to the political, the social, and the economic freedom that they should have. And so it was his responsibility, or he took it as his responsibility, to ensure that people would be able to hear the language of liberation, the language of freedom in their own voices, from their own perspective. And so he made sure that we understood, in his words, that God is on the side of the oppressed. And if we do not speak to the raising of the oppressed, the liberation of the oppressed, the freedom of the oppressed, we have done damage to the one whom we say we follow, who is Jesus Christ, who in his inaugural sermon said, "I've come to liberate." And that's the foundation, a part of the foundation of liberation theology.
Great, thank you. So Doc, all of us who are on this call or on this video, we understand where we are relative to unrest. So the social unrest in the US over the last 4 years, coupled with the tumultuous election cycle, showing how racially and socially divided our country really is at this moment. Religion and faith, as you just mentioned, have always played a pivotal role in how people shape their identity and also their worldview. Many Americans are experiencing friction as it relates to their worldview not matching up with their faith and how they are perceived and accepted in society. So what is the significance of religion and faith when understanding the need for social justice and a culture of peace and equity?
Mhm. Well, that's an interesting question, because people historically have used religion to suppress and oppress rather than to liberate. And so you have to look at it from a multifaceted point of view. And I think the role of religion, as I see it, is to ensure, and Dr. Murray kindly said that when introducing me, to ensure that all people have an opportunity to breathe. I want to use that phrase that we so infamously heard George Floyd using this summer when he said, "I can't breathe." A part of it is because a knee was on his neck. We get that. But if we were to expand the metaphor, we would understand that it is, again, systems of injustice, that for decades, this country, United States of America, has had in place oppressive structures and systems that kept certain people behind. When you think of the responsibility or the need for the civil rights movement, it was because structures and systems kept people out of access to qualitative life, So whenever there are issues of poverty, and poverty can be systemic. And whenever there are issues of inequity of any kind with regard to education, with regard to job security, with regard to food, whenever you are in certain communities and they're identified as food deserts, that's a structure, that's a system that needs to be overcome. When you deal with classism and racism, all of those isms about which we speak, sexism, ageism, those are structures that say this kind of person does not even deserve a qualitative lifestyle, a qualitative abundance of life, to use the words of Jesus. And so it is the responsibility of those of us who espouse social justice, those of us who understand the liberating work of Jesus Christ and follow after it and seek to pursue it, seeking to pursue peace as a consequence of it. Because if these structures stay in place, there will be no peace. There will always be unrest. There will always be societal enmity. And so it is necessary for us who think soberly about what it means to have what Dr. King calls the beloved community. If we're going to have that, there are no have-nots. There are no have-nots. Everyone is included at the table. I've often, since you referenced Pastor Lawson, I've often been intrigued by his mantra He says that part of his role in society is to be a bridge between the haves and the have-nots, so that those who seemingly are out of the picture, those on the periphery of the society, can understand that there is a word spoken to them that says you are welcome at the table. You can have an equitable lifestyle. You can have an opportunity to make productivity and progress your reality. Okay, so I'll take a long time to answer if you don't stop me. So you have to stop me.
No, but this is great. This is exactly what I think our audience wants to hear.
Sure.
So Pastor Cosby, you're a preacher, scholar, and teacher. As someone who is responsible for educating not only our children, but also the next generation of ministers, and also your congregation at Wheeler and congregations around the world, how do you frame social justice teaching and practice for all of these constituency groups?
Yeah. Well, on the first day of any of my classes at the seminary, well, the first day, we are it is almost guaranteed that we're going to look at the passage that I referenced a moment ago, Luke chapter 4, verse 18. Because my perspective or my a priori, I come to the teaching of preaching. That's what I do. I teach preaching. I come to the teaching of preaching saying that each of us should have as our foundation the ministry of Jesus, the preaching ministry of Jesus. Jesus was a preacher, unapologetically a preacher. And so as we look at the preaching ministry of Jesus, on the initial day of his ministry, when he first started to preach, Luke 4:18 says he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he took the scroll that from which he read from Isaiah chapter 61, which says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. Because the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, opening of prison. So I stand on the first day of any class and say, what you're going to get in this class is foundational with regard to the ministry of Jesus. I want you to be a Christocentric preacher, Christ-centered. And Christ took as his mantra the upsetting of the status quo. So we don't have an option to not speak to those who are on the periphery of the society, because it is clear from the first day of the ministry of Jesus, the first sermon he preached was, I am going to set the captives free. I want people to be liberated. And so our preaching ministry should come from that perspective, that we come to liberate people, to transform people's lives. Those who were downtrodden should be lifted up. Those who were burdened should have that weight released or relieved from them. And so that's the mantra. So as I teach preachers, not just in the seminary, but here at our church, and we have quite a few preachers here at our church, I want them to understand that it is not enough simply to preach a feel-good gospel in a world that is so filled with inequity. It is insufficient. You are doing a disservice to the one you say has called you to this ministry, to not touch the lives of people who don't feel as if they are included. They are always excommunicated from the reality of qualitative life. And so when we preach, this is one of my favorite lines, if we can't preach this same gospel in third world countries, in places where people do not have access to food and to water and to the kinds of financial breakthroughs, to use the kinds of language of some persons in pulpits, if this gospel that we preach is not available and portable for all people, it's not available to any people.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, Doc, tuning in, we have Buddhists, we
Mhm.
have atheists, we have Christians, we have Muslims, we have people of multiple faiths, and we have non-believers. What are some of the strategies that you would recommend to people that, we're in the midst of a pandemic, dealing with all of the financial, but also the human emotional impact of being isolated, which also leads to challenges relative to mental illness. And all of this is still framed within our understanding of how we still, as citizens, have a responsibility to social justice. So how would you, what are some of the strategies that you would give to some of these, so, to our viewing audience who are of multiple faiths, who find it difficult to hold on to the faith in times like these?
Mhm. So I think it goes back first to the three amigos whom you referenced. They understood that they had the strength of shared beliefs,
Mhm.
which is part of the mantra of interfaith ministries here in our city. I served on the board of interfaith ministries when I first came to Houston back in the late 90s. And that was their theme, that there is the strength of shared beliefs. And when we understand that all people, no matter your faith tradition, have access or should have access to a common humanity, and humanity is beyond just living. Humanity is being able to experience life to its abundance, to its fullest. And when we understand that all people should have that access, and when you do not come to the table with the mentality that only this group of people or that group of people should be permitted the opportunity to experience a qualitative life, then we have shared beliefs. We have shared beliefs. I believe, as my Buddhist brothers and sisters believe, and as my Hindu sisters and brothers believe, and even as my atheist sisters and brothers believe, I believe that we ought be able to have a good life. A good life. And that good life means that some structures have to be broken down. So I don't have to say, I don't have to come to the table with the perspective that only people who follow Jesus can provide such a good life. I believe that all people who love people, and that really is the basis of it all. If you love people, if you love the fact that all of us are in what should be the beloved community, then you have a responsibility to help all people, and not just the people that look like you, talk like you, believe like you. And so that is part of what I have tried to hold on to as I've done ministry. And it is not always easy, because there will always be the temptation to allow the wedge issues to divide you. There will always be the temptation to allow that the reality that I don't think like you think on a certain subject to divide you. I'm always intrigued, and this is a kind of a side note, I'm intrigued by those marriages where one spouse is a Republican and the other spouse is a Democrat, but they're married and they're having a good life with one another. It literally means that they don't allow all the issues that could separate them to keep them from having a love relationship that prospers. And so I think when we understand that there's this word that permeates the scriptures, and I'll use it and I'll be done with the answer. The shalom. It starts in the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew word shalom. It is peace, but it is more than just the absence of strife. It is a wholeness. And I think that when we understand our responsibility as community leaders, faith leaders, as people in the struggle for human rights, I think when we help people to understand there's a wholeness that is possible,
Yes.
then we can fight for that wholeness, and that will allow us to break down barriers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Cosby. This whole notion of a universalist aesthetic, that we're all here inhabiting this one space called the earth. We have different beliefs, we have different structures, but there should be a focus on just that universal principle of doing unto others as you would have others do unto you, and understanding how that situates itself within a frame of social justice and social justice activism. And one of the things is aborting this notion of the fact that if I advance, and that means that you don't advance, and getting to an understanding of how we as a society advance together for human rights, for social justice, and that it only makes us a more stronger society
Mhm.
when we can tout globally that we're eradicating, as you mentioned, all of these we're eradicating homelessness, we're eradicating food people who have living in food deserts, for people who have for folk who don't have adequate access to education. So, I have to drop the education and
Absolutely, absolutely.
slice it, making certain that that people do have access to education, ensconced in this whole thing called the American dream.
Mm,
However, Dr. Cosby, as things are a little crazy right now, and
absolutely.
lately our society oftentimes is described as being polarized and politicized.
Mhm.
So again, from your standpoint, how do you, as a leader, activist, and parent, talk to your children? You already talked a little bit about your students, but talk to about speak with other ministers, with other people of faith about the importance of social justice and also the constant role of activism.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you would ask that. Earlier in the summertime, when we were dealing with the, the heinous reality of George Floyd's death, we began to have certain conversations similar to this one on Tuesdays at our church. And we were talking to various people about their thoughts and what was going on with regard to the pandemic and the protests and the world of politics. And I was able to have a conversation just like this with Pastor Steve Wells.
Mm.
Pastor Steve Wells spoke at George Floyd's funeral. He is a white pastor here in our city at South Main Baptist Church. And we have, although there could be some things that separate us, we have the strength of shared beliefs. And I asked him about some of the white evangelical pastors who have not spoken out against the injustices, the racial challenges, and have been fairly mute on the subject. And we had a real lively discussion about some of the things that have kept us divided instead of brought us together. And many, and I was on several conferences like this one with other white pastors, and they said that they just didn't know. They just didn't know about what was going on because and I hazard to use this phrase, but one said that his head was in the sand about certain issues. I think part of it is education. May I use that word? Is education, making sure that everyone knows the issues of the day. Because if we're not careful, when we get into our silos, about which I spoke, when we get into our silos, we will forget that there's a whole other group of people. There are other groups of people who do not have the same kind of privileges that we enjoy. And so I think when we come to this issue of political unrest and the racial injustice that we've been living through while dealing with a pandemic, that there have been certain people who have just not cared or have not known to care about a whole other group of people because they're doing so well. And part of the challenge that all of us have, whatever your ethnicity, if you're upwardly mobile by nature, if because of your educational advancements, because of your familial experience, if you're upwardly mobile by nature, you can sometimes forget that there are people who are stuck in the quagmire of poverty and lack of food and inadequate housing, inadequate books in schools, in communities. And so part of the challenge that we face now is that we have not had the conversations that were necessary. If you listen to the political conversation from the current president, it's economy, economy, economy. The stock market, stock market, stock market. But for those who are entrenched in poverty, they have no notion of stock market and what that means with regard to advancement. And if we don't speak to the people who are not at all in conversation with economic advancement to that degree, then we are not allowing our entire community, the entire national community, to thrive as it should. And so I say to my children, I say to our congregation, we cannot be so progressive. My children will not have, thank God, the kinds of challenges that I had growing up financially. They won't experience that. They have never had to experience that. Praise God for that. I praise God for that. So, but I have the responsibility to tell them that there are people who do not have the same kinds of economic advancements and realities that you have. And you are responsible. You are responsible to do your part to change that. You may not have the pulpit that I have. You may not have the microphone that I have, but there will be some way that you can shift the trajectory of someone's life. It doesn't have to be on a macro level. It can be on a micro level, but every one of us has the responsibility to educate ourselves on someone else's plight and do our best to shift that. I close with this. That same church about which Dr. Murray spoke, out of which I came in Chicago, sang a song that I often reference at Wheeler Avenue, and it said, "Brighten up the corner where you are. Make your space better." However you need to do that, by whatever means you need to do that. Maybe you will not be a Dr. Tillis who has access to a whole educational community. Maybe you won't be a Marcus Cosby that has access to a whole congregational community and a community beyond it. But I still have the responsibility, whomever I am, to make my world better in any way that I possibly can.
Excellent, excellent. Are there times, Dr. Cosby, when social justice and religion are in conflict with one another?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. If you come to the religious experience with a faulty worldview, if you come to the religious experience with the worldview that I just have to make my space better, then yes, there will always be conflict. If I come to the religious experience with just the prosperity theology, and that is a thing now, with just making myself more prosperous, it's just me, myself, and I. It really is akin to the question I just tried to answer. If it's just about me, we will always be in jeopardy as a worldwide community. So our responsibility is to move away from the egocentric understanding of religion, that religion is not just about me, that the theological perspectives that I have must be communal. From the tradition out of which I come, we understand that the first institution that God created was family. The first institution God created was family, because we believe that God wanted us to have a communal understanding of human relationships, that I am not just isolated unto myself. And so we have to rethink, reimagine our understandings. We have this thought, I think, therefore I am. And I think that's a bit limiting. The African perspective says, I am because we are. And we are because I am. That there's always this need to think of the other. And we've been talking a lot over the last several months and years about xenophobia that has risen up because it is the fear of the other. Mm-hmm. And whenever I have a fear of the other, I will do whatever I can to devalue the other and keep the other out of access to qualitative life, keep the other away from the table, keep the other, because there's something about that other that intimidates me, that makes me insecure. Maybe it's the fear that I'll lose my own power, my own placement. And so when we have the fear of the other, whomever that other is, it always limits our opportunity to have the beloved community. I'm going to keep using that phrase because I believe that phrase that Dr. King helped us to understand is what should broaden our understanding of who we are as human beings, that we are all interconnected. And we cannot ever lose our interconnectedness simply trying to make advancements for ourselves.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly, that, when we really unpack what Dr. King meant relative to that beloved community, we realize that all of the phobias and isms about which you spoke have no place in our consciousness as we strive to actualize what Dr. King meant. And it's also really, again, de-epistemologizing the way in which we have learned certain types of things, and really getting away from what you are referencing, this zero-sum game, that if I and my community, if we advance, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the declination of another community. And I think that these types of ideologies have to be addressed and spoken, as you say, truth to power, as we in multiple communities, strive to move forward, lock in step for social justice, and making certain that, you're going back to African proverbs and others that say, if there is injustice anywhere in the world, it affects me, irrespective of where I am in the world. I could sit here and I could talk to you for hours and hours relative
Yes, sir.
to this subject, because it's one that is so, it is so important to understand what social justice is, but also to understand the space that religion has played in catapulting and moving our society forward. So, again, I want to leave some time for question and answer, but I would like to just turn it over to you to see if there are any last words that you want to say before I turn it over to Dr. Murray for question and answers.
So the word justice, it intrigues me, and we hear it a lot now. So what is a just society? What is an equitable society? What is a fair society? When do we get to the point where everyone has wholeness? And how do we fight for it? How do we stay connected to the fight for wholeness of all people? I think every year we find another issue or another group of issues that we need to address. And so none of us can do it all. And so that's why I want to go back to finding my place, my space of in the fight. Finding my place in the fight. I want every person who's listening to us, every person who is watching us, to know that you have a place in the fight. Now, every one of us will not fight the same fight, but all of us need to be fighting. We need to be fighting. And so I would encourage every person who has some kind of inclination toward justice issues or a just society, where people are all treated fairly, to find that thing that is for you to fight for. You don't have to fight for everything. Maybe it is that you want to fight for women's issues because you know the glass ceiling needs to be shattered. You know that women need to have the access into every space and be paid the same wages for the same kind of work. Maybe that's your issue. Fight for it. Maybe your issue is children, making sure that children have adequate health care, and all people actually have adequate health care. Children have adequate educational advancements and possibilities. Make sure you fight for it. Get and be knowledgeable before you start talking. Get the information that is necessary and fight for it. Maybe it is homophobia. You want to eradicate homophobia in the world. Fight for it, whatever it is. Get that, and then make sure that you don't always criticize people who don't have the same fight. Because if their fight is different, maybe their fight is not your fight. Now, of course, there will be some people who will fight for everything, but everybody is not in that space. And we have to be able to have enough space at the table for all the fighters to fight for what they need to fight for. And I'm using fight as a metaphor, and I hope no one gets offended by the reality that there's just some stuff we need to fight for. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for Dr. Cosby. And with that, Dr. Murray, questions? Dr. Murray, I think you're muted.
Yes, questions. The chat is blowing up over here. And so I'm going to quickly ask some of these questions that have come through in the last 30 minutes. One attendee says, it is hard to hear that someone may call me their sister in Christ, but when their political beliefs feel as if they are not in accordance with the teachings of Christ. How can I rectify these feelings to once again be open to hearing individuals that do not respect me call me their sister?
Well, I think that they're at that same table, there has to be space for disagreement. There has to be space for the acknowledgement that I may not agree with you. And I don't think that disagreement means that we have to disdain a person. And I will never be on the side of one who disrespects a person. And there's some people you may not be able to have a relationship with because of their disrespect. But I think there has to be dialogue, and all these D words. There has to be dialogue at the table that allows for our disagreements. I don't agree with every Christian in the world on everything. I don't agree with every preacher on every subject, but I have space enough to have dialogue. I'm trying to have bandwidth enough to have dialogue with persons with whom I disagree. And we may never agree, like that husband and wife who are Republican and Democrat. We may never agree, but that does not give me the opportunity to disrespect you or disdain you.
There's someone in the chat that said, my wife votes Republican and I vote Democrat, and we are happy.
Absolutely.
However, when people ask me if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I answer, I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
Another question says, what would be the top 3 action items that a local church could take on in 2021 to address social justice issues?
Wow. Dr. Murray, you know that's going to differ from church to church, because first of all, the leadership of the church, the consciousness of the church is going to differ based on the resources of a church. And so to have a definitive answer for that is almost unfair, because every church will have a different bent and a different responsibility. They will take onto themselves a different responsibility for social justice issues. I think though, after saying that, every church is responsible to a communal understanding of justice. And so every church must have, if they're going to call themselves a Christian church, every church must have some responsibility to some issue. I grew up in a church in Chicago where the issue was education. Educate children. Educate children. That was the issue. And so there was not the issue, or there was not always the prominence of the issue of racism or of sexism. But that didn't mean that our church didn't have a focus on some issue of injustice. And so I think we have to be very careful not to cast dispersions on any congregation because their issue may differ from another congregation's. But in my estimation, every church should have a bevy of issues, a listing of issues, their top 3 issues.
And Dr. Cosby, I think you addressed this in your conversation earlier, but I just want to make sure that we answer this in a manner for our audience. What would you say to people that believe that religion doesn't have a place in social justice just because it toes the line in what this person says is too political?
Well, I don't think we can have a church community that is not interested in political issues, because from the political issues come the justice issues most often. So I think we cannot call ourselves a Christian community concerned with people following Christ and not engage in political concerns. Jesus found, when you read the words of Jesus and read the Gospels in the New Testament of the Bible, you'll find that Jesus is in constant conversation, and that's a nice way of saying it, with the governmental officials. He insistently and intentionally gets in the face of the government because he understood that the government had structures and systems that continually allowed oppression to reign. And so Jesus would get in the face of religious rulers, yes, and governmental officials, and tell them this is not the way that the kingdom, according to scriptures, or the beloved community should exist.
Thank you for that. This question discusses how there are multiple communities and multiple issues that we deal with. And so this attendee wanted to know, can Christians and members of the LGBTQ community work hand in hand when it relates to issues of social justice, and how can that happen?
The quick answer is yes, but the broader answer is a little more intricate, because there are still parts of the Christian community that are hesitant, if not resistant, to conversations with the LGBTQ community. Now, that is a whole other discourse, whole other conversation. There are other parts of the Christian community that are willing to have the conversations, willing to open the door, sit at the table, and let's talk together about how we can work together. But the reality is there are certain persons who will not be there. They're not there yet. And I often challenge us, and I know that everyone wants everyone to respect and appreciate and honor and include everyone, but everyone's not there. I mentioned that just a few minutes ago, that just because it's not my issue does not mean that that I invalidate it, or that I am not in some way working on some other issues. I think we have to find the partners, have to find the strength of shared beliefs, going back to that Interfaith Ministries mantra. We have to find the people who are able to work with us and walk with us and share the beliefs that all persons have access to the abundant life and the beloved, and access to the table where the conversations are being held, and know that there is a change that is coming with regard to how people perceive other people, whatever that other may be. And know that as we keep working with people who are in partnership with us, changes come, mentalities shift, entrenched philosophies and even theologies shift. And we have to be open. Everybody has to be open to where other people are and be able to accept the reality that we can move forward when we find those persons who have the shared beliefs with us. And they are in the church. For the LGBT community, those persons are in the church. Not all church people, but not all church people think that women should be in ministry, and not all church people think that children should be heard, not just seen. That there are issues. That the church is not a perfect place. It is not a perfect place because it has people in it, and any institution that has people in it is always already imperfect. And so we have to at least wrestle with and fight for those things that will help us to all have qualitative life and be less than oppressed.
Thank you. And this will be our last question from the audience. And Dr. Tillis actually talked about this earlier as it relates to this summer and the political climate that we are experiencing currently in the U.S. This attendee says, what steps would you suggest, Dr. Cosby, for talking to people who do not believe that there is an issue of social injustices occurring in the United States?
Yeah. That goes back to that conversation I had with a bunch of white pastors, several conversations over the summer with white pastors. There was, first of all, the acknowledgement that there's an issue. Now that the world is watching, as a consequence of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now that the world is watching, you can't deny it. Let's start with this issue, that police brutality against an unarmed Black man happened, okay? And no one can deny it, okay? The nation is in uproar. Now that we've opened the door with this issue, let's lay out a few more issues that are real. You may not have heard about them because you sit in a position of privilege, and white privilege is a real thing. So let's talk about white privilege for a minute and why white privilege is a real thing. Because of systems and structures that have been in place for generations that have disallowed Black people, brown people, women, other minorities to have placement at the table. So now that we've gotten that on the table, let's talk about it. And there are people who are open to the conversation, even if they don't participate in transformation. At least they have heard. You have sat in a position of authority and power and privilege, and now you have to at least acknowledge the fact that people of other groups need some access. And if you call yourself Christian, you are responsible to have the conversation. And over the summer, pastors in that conference said, I'm preaching about racism this summer. This coming Sunday, I'm going to preach about injustice this summer. I'm going to talk about police brutality. Everyone didn't say that, Dr. Murray, but some of them did. And if I can change, if I can help to change, I'm not going to change. If I can help to change 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 people, I'm doing pretty well. I'm brightening up the corner where I am. And I'm allowing there to be some sense of justice for other people who may not have access to the kinds of conversations that I have access to because of my placement in the community.
Thank you. And the moment I said this was the last question, like five people hit enter at the same time. One of the things that sparked my attention was, can we please extend this or do another one? This is so good. There were questions that popped up about Black liberation theology, God and country. Let's talk about how we extend this and look at various phobias that people have as it relates to race and religion. And so I know that people want to know and hear more from Dr. Cosby as well as Dr. Phyllis.
Oh my, that's very kind. Those are all Wheeler Avenue people. They're just nice. They're just nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, it looks as if we're coming to the end of this amazing conversation. So Dr. Cosby, it has been my pleasure to engage with you as you have really touched on some wonderful kernels that our audience can take back as they begin to think about, you know, what's my point, you know, what is my position and what is my calling relative to social justice, relative to things that are important to me and how I am to move that needle. You know, tackling religion and social justice is not an easy conversation. So we thank you for the honesty, thank you for the candor, but we thank you for the challenge, and that oftentimes we do need to be challenged as people. Thus, on behalf of the University of Houston Downtown, you know, our faculty, our staff, our students, our alumni, our donor base, again, a very hearty thank you for your honesty, for your scholarly perspectives, and for sharing in this Gator Grit with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a joy to share with you. I am grateful that you would choose me. There's so many of my colleagues and others in the community who would have done such a better job, but I'm grateful that I've been able to share with you, and I'm available to you whenever I can share with the University of Houston Downtown. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And on that note, for those of you who have tuned in, thank you so much for the attention that you've given to this. You can also send emails to Dr. Cosby, and his staff will assist in answering some of the questions. And then for those of you who are in the community, stop by online, because they say that Wheeler is everywhere these days. Yes. And I can say that Wheeler is everywhere. But again, thank you, and thank you for your interest in the University of Houston Downtown and taking part in this Gator Grit conversation. Yes. Have a great Thursday.
You do the same. Thank you so much.